So I want to talk about the risks in 2025, what I'm identifying as top risks to the world. Obviously, we keep going back to your country and obviously the thing that's happening, but I think Russia-Ukraine escalation is my number one risk, actually, as we look ahead to next year. And the reasons for that are a few. So what we're seeing is that, and again, your president just spoke, I think it was for 4 or 5 hours, as he does every year, right before Christmas. And he gives his rundown on the year in review and everything else. And he confirmed that his goals for the what they call the special military operation, right, the conflict, is the same as it was on day one. No backing down, no NATO for Ukraine, demilitarization of Ukraine, and now obviously annexing the 4 provinces that they don't fully control yet either. So Russia's not changing its tone whatsoever. What we've seen from Ukraine is, for the first time very recently, particularly after Trump's election, they might be willing to negotiate on territory, but not around NATO and these other things. So my concern is, given what we just talked about with all the escalation that we've seen in 2024, particularly now the West is considering the UK and France maybe deploying troops, we're running out of room on the ladder of escalation, which is a concerning situation. So again, are we going to see more North Korean troops deployed, to Russia? That could obviously be important. What is China going to be doing about all of this? Are we going to see, and these are some of the things I want to look out for, are we going to see a Trump and Putin summit? This is something that they've discussed. That could be a potential for a breakthrough, potential for peace. It could also go poorly, in which case, what are we going to see after that? Trump and Ukraine aid, is he going to not give aid? In which case, that could either be de-escalatory or escalatory, depending on what happens. Do the Europeans then deploy troops? Do they step up the funding? Or does Trump increase funding, which again puts more pressure on the conflict itself? We just don't know what's going to happen. Again, we talked about, is the UK and France going to deploy troops? That would obviously be a huge escalation, huge change. North Korean involvement we discussed, and again, what's China going to do in all of this as we enter next year? So again, I see that the war is almost reaching some sort of crescendo where there's not much more escalation that can take place, which makes me worried it's going to get worse before it gets better. So I would identify that as my number one risk for next year.
Totally
Any
agree
initial
with you.
thoughts?
Totally agree with you. This is also one of the risks that I identified. And I agree with you on all these reasons because, first of all, this is the conflict in the heart of Europe. So many parties are involved. And the shape of the conflict today is very different from it was 2 years ago or even in the beginning of 2024. So yeah, the stakes are higher. And at the same time, I can see the change of, the rhetoric, because previously all the heads of the states, they refused to negotiate and communicate with the Russian president at all, and now we can see that they just met with the Prime Minister of Slovakia. There was a conversation with German chancellor. I know all these countries, they also have their own agenda and they try to get their points. Like obviously Germany tries to get the points for their the chancellor tries to get the points for his internal popularity or whatever, but anyway, there are some changes, and I anticipate there will be more changes in the conflict in 2025. And yeah, they can be both for better or for worse.
Yeah, and I think we're just running out of room in terms of where this goes, because again, this year Ukraine lowered its conscription age from 27 to 25. That's still not really stemming the bleeding on the front line from Ukraine's perspective. They continue to lose ground at a quicker pace. So they're stuck between political options. Do you then lower the conscription age to 18? To what extent are you going to continue to fight this conflict, which is obviously really detrimental to both sides? Casualty figures are over 100,000 on both sides, the most deadly conflict we've seen in a long time. From a conventional war perspective, possibly since World War II, at least in Europe. Obviously, there's been others, but what does Russia do? Do they, mobilize? Do they do anything like that? We just don't know what's going to happen. And I think, again, you're just running out of additional options. So it just gets a bit more concerning as to where this all goes. So yeah, let's see. My number two risk, again, very similar to, it's almost like a rehash of what's happened in 2024, conflict with Iran. So again, the reason I bring that up is pretty much highlighting what we already discussed from the 2024 perspective, which is the fall of Syria obviously has dramatically weakened Iran in the region, which also served in many ways as their protective deterrent, so to speak. So in their conflict with Israel over time, they've always said, well, we can always deploy our allies to more directly affect you, which would obviously be in Lebanon and others. Now that that's essentially been neutralized, what I've been reading is that recently both the U.S. and Israel has come out and said that they would both consider preemptive strikes. Both of them have said in the past couple of days, preemptive strikes on Iran are on the table in order to do something about their nuclear program. So again, is this a negotiating tactic? Possibly. But again, I think the one thing with Trump and the one thing we're now going to see in 2025, the middle ground is the least likely outcome. Either we're going to get a deal or we're going to get escalation. So again, status quo, I think, is the only thing that's going to change. So again, that would be important. Obviously, implications for oil, for the economy. It's a huge country. So I think that's a huge risk that I see is what's going to happen there. Hopefully it ends with a deal. But I think the risk of conflict is higher in 2025, direct conflict, than it was in 2024. So we'll see on that. And then finally, my third risk is, again, slightly different, but the economy. So on the economy, again, a lot of people haven't been talking too much about economic risk probably over the past year. Economy's been growing, inflation's been coming down, all of that. But I want to highlight to the audience something that the central banks of the world call something that's the long and variable lag. Have you heard of this term?
No.
So essentially, right, you raise interest rates and then you see what happens. And what we typically see is that it takes years for the impact of those interest rate increases to have a real effect in the economy. So why I bring this up, in 2004, the Fed began hiking interest rates and we had a major recession in 2008, end of 2007. That's what I mean by long and variable lags. It took about 3 or 4 years before the impact really bled through the economy. Before that, it was 1998. Yeah, were you going to say something?
I wonder, I might be wrong, but I think the reason for the 2007 crisis was not the high interest rate, but on the contrary, the cheap loans.
So, right. So mixed story, right? So it's the lowering of the interest rates artificially beforehand, which is what was done under Alan Greenspan after the dot-com bubble, which then reignited what was then a huge bubble, right? Because when you drop interest rates too low, you then incentivize what's called quote unquote malinvestment.
Okay, I see. So you mean it's like a pendulum?
Yeah. And then what happens is you lowered it too much. Everybody's making these risky loans. Everybody thinks they can afford everything. They take on all this debt and then you jack up interest rates again, and now you got to pay for it. So that actually leads me to the previous time, 1998, the Fed, the U.S. Federal Reserve, started hiking interest rates. 2000, major recession, the dot-com bust. Yeah. So I think we're now entering that time where it's been about 3 years since we started raising interest rates. That's where things get a little bit concerning. Let's not forget in 2022, everybody was predicting 100% chance of recession. That's what all the recession indicators said. It didn't happen. And now we're seeing that the latest thing I read as of today, the latest recession gauges say a 0% chance of recession. I actually think that's a concerning thing. When everybody's on one side, typically the risk of the other thing happening is high. So again, we've got inflation that's still above 2%. It's around 3%. Which is up from what the lowest was over the summer this year. So we're now ticking back up in the wrong direction, which means the U.S. is less likely to lower interest rates. That's bad for the rest of the world. The dollar's going to be stronger. It obviously keeps rates a bit higher. Trump's policies obviously could move in any direction on this. There's a huge amount of uncertainty with him coming in. So again, if a trade war breaks out between the U.S. and any of its top 4 trading partners, I mean, that alone could cause a recession. So regardless of all the other stuff we've talked about, if he's able to pump a bunch more oil and gas into the economy by deregulating and all that, that's really positive. We got no clue what's going to happen next year. But the one thing, again, I want to reiterate is in 2022, when everybody said recession gauge 100%, what happened? No recession. Now, I read as of today, 0% chance of recession next year. I'm calling. I'm not going to say the word, but I'm calling nonsense on that. I think the stock market's going to be down next year. I think it's going to be down significantly. I think you could even see some sort of crash down by 25+%. because again, this whole dynamic doesn't look good. It just doesn't look good. So again, that's a risk factor. Doesn't have to go that way, but again, that's my third risk, and I think we've got three major risk factors.
Michael, economic conspiracy theories.
And I was going to say, and you've been calling me that for a while now, and for my friends and everything, they've heard me talk about the risks of the economy now since 2022. There has been no recession, so I probably do sound like a broken record, but I want to go on record as saying I think we're going to get some sort of stock market crash, severe correction next year. I also want to point out for the audience, we'll share some of the graphs. The stock market on a relative basis is way above historical margins from a PE ratio perspective, from a forward earnings multiple perspective. Again, I don't know how deep into economics or finance you are, but it's well above historical norms significantly. And what we typically see when that happens is you need to come back down to earth. So again, a forward earnings multiple of the S&P 500 of 25 when the historical average is 15, that's not good.
I think majority of indexes are at all-time high now.
All-time highs, exactly. And the U.S. in particular has a higher multiple than everybody else. So I think all these things are major risk factors. So again, I'm going on record. I think stock market is down significantly next year. Call it a crash, call it a severe correction. And that's one of my, again, risks is going to be the economy. Okay. So let's see.
Okay. I will add only... Honestly, I will add only one to yours because, again, we have the overlap. So what I can see, I agree with you on the war conflicts that will continue to evolve, and probably we will see more countries to be involved in this directly or indirectly. But what I also think is, again, with all the far-right movements and with the rise of the nationalism in the countries, we will see that the more countries will look internally in their internal affairs, especially the major ones: Germany, the United States, maybe even Russia, outside of the conflicts. But then, what I think is when the majors look internally, they leave the space for the area of interest to be open. So if the US will switch their focus from the Middle East to their internal affairs, or from the Latin America to their internal affairs, then you will leave the vacuum on these areas, and we might see more like social unrest and social unrise in these areas. That's the risk that I can see. I can see this happening somewhere in the Middle East, in Africa, or in Latin America.
Totally agree. I think you're already seeing a bit of that in Latin America in particular. I think that's a great point. So
less in Middle East. I think they have they had this share already, but I think we can see something in Latin America and in Africa.
Yeah, absolutely, totally agree.